everybody. Welcome to this episode of This Week in VS with Razib Khan, the Blackjack of Genetics. Thank you so much for being on the show, Razib.
Yeah, I'm excited.
I'm totally stoked. So what I want to do is kind of start out. Why don't you tell everybody who you are, what you do, what you love, what you know, any projects you're working on. Just tell us all about you.
Well, right now my day job is as a head of content for a startup in Texas, personal genomics startup called Insightome. It was started by the founder is Spencer Wells, who used to be at National Geographic, and a lot of people watched his documentary Journey of Man and read his book. And he's a geneticist, and so am I. And so what I do mostly is I do a lot of content creation. So I write blog posts. I run a podcast called The Insight. So if you do The Insight, you search it, it'll be the one that has it's like a green logo, but it's the one related to genetics and evolution. We usually talk to researchers in the field, but sometimes it'll just be Spencer and I. And, so I do that. I also do some basic science work because we have some products, some personal genomics products to do like ancestry analysis and stuff like that. And so population structure and ancestry analysis, kind of my bread and butter. So I'm a population geneticist that kind of focuses on genetic variation, especially human populations, although I have some background in canine and feline genetics as well. So, kind of animal agnostic. I run a blog called Gene Expression, which I think you know about from Twitter, which I linked to. That blog's been around in various forms since 2002. So it's a long time. Used to be a group blog. Now it's just me. And it's been hosted on various platforms. And now I kind of brought it back to just its original domain. I have written for various publications, kind of fell into science journalism over my career just because I like to communicate and I like to talk about genetics, which is kind of become my passion. I have undergraduate background in biology and biochemistry. I studied genetics in graduate school at UC Davis. So, I've kind of been like stepping further and further into this world over the years. And that's what I do. And I have a Twitter account and I engage with people on Twitter as well. Although, to be totally honest, I'm kind of fading out from that. I think Twitter has some shortcomings as a medium, and I'm going to do more blogging, continue to do the podcasting, try to do more writing, and just not do as much social media. So.
Well, I certainly understand that. So this is pretty exciting. So you're part of a startup, you have a podcast, you're very active in science communication. So let's talk a little bit about what do you particularly write about on your blog? What is the meat mostly?
Yeah, I read about what's interesting to me at the time, and that obviously varies. I've been doing this since 2002. That's a long time. I've been doing this, half a generation or more, So I've had lots of interests and, lots of topics. So right now, for example, if you go to my blog, a lot of stuff about ancient DNA, like the genetic analysis of ancient samples and all this. When I started writing in 2002, that couldn't have existed. Like we didn't even do genetic analysis of modern samples the way we could do with ancient samples today. So to give you a concrete example, when I started blogging, in 2002, to understand the genetic relationship between different populations, you could look at 100 genetic positions in the genome and try to figure it out from that. Today, you routinely look at 100,000 to 1 million positions, or all 3 billion base pairs. Even with the ancient DNA, you look at hundreds of thousands of genetic positions. So you have DNA from someone that's lived 10,000 years ago, and you have orders of magnitude more information than you did when I started blogging just for me and you, And so the information content is so much higher than it was. The whole field has transformed. The word genomics was pretty newfangled back in the early 2000s, and now genetics and genomics, there's really not that much difference.
Right. So I have a question for you. I was looking at recently, you posted something on the genomics of the Viking age. Which I found to be pretty interesting. I know Vikings are really big right now, particularly on the History Channel that had that entire series, which has kind of sparked a lot of interest in, that particular population of individuals. So how much do you think as far as change I know there's like you can date by molecular clock, go back and kind of count how many mutations or differences between the two. I don't know how much you know about that, but how much has changed have they done comparative studies with current individuals in the area to, ancestors? How much change has happened, do you think you can see in that?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty well understood, especially for Scandinavia. They had, I think, I'm going off the top of my head, I think it's 344 samples, ancient samples from the Vikings. And so modern samples, they're tens of thousands. Like I have 6,000 on my computer of Swedes, just one of my consulting projects, right? So I have 6,000 SNP chip arrays of people in Sweden. So, basically, the way I will explain it is what we have found out, geneticists, is that most of the genetic variation that you see in Europe, let's talk about Northern Europe, probably dates to 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. And then by the Viking Age, people were pretty similar in Scandinavia to what they are today. The main exceptions from this paper, it looks like, is there was gene flow from, say, Britain and the Baltic, a little bit of that. There was gene flow from Denmark north into Sweden, into Norway, and from a few other areas of the world. And this is probably because, one, they bring slaves back, slaves, wives, these sorts of things. Because Viking is a verb, right? You go a Viking. And so, Vikings settled in other places, like they founded Kiev, in the Ukraine, and obviously like in England, there was the Danelaw, but they also came back. And so they brought people back with them. And also Denmark, with Jutland has traditionally had a bigger population. I think Sweden might have a bigger population now, but Denmark traditionally has like a big population. And so it's, people moved north into Norway and into central Sweden. And I can tell you that, like the northern half of Sweden was actually settled pretty recently after like 1500. It used to be inhabited by a lot of Sami people, who are the indigenous people of the very far north. And so they were pushed out actually very, very recently, partly because modern agronomy allowed, Swedes to engage in agriculture further and further north. So there's been a little bit of change since the Viking era, but the Vikings, like if you were dropped back, in Scandinavia back then, like you wouldn't draw much notice. Well, you don't have to wear no glasses, but if you wear glasses, you draw notice. But
these are my magic spectacles. I should be burned.
Yeah, if you went back 5,000 years ago, it would be totally different. There was a lot of genetic change in Scandinavia between about, say, let's talk about like 2,500 BC and 1800 BC. There was a huge amount of genetic change, right? And so if you went back to the end of the last ice age, when like it was covered in ice and the first people came, those people are totally different than the people who live in Scandinavia now. The people in Scandinavia now and in much of Europe arrived within the last 4,000 to 5,000 years from basically what you would say is maybe the Ukraine, the Volga region, from the central West Eurasian steppe.
All right. That's pretty cool. I know. I actually worked in undergrad on the Tree of Life project, where we were trying to place different beetles. And so how we would categorize that, we were rearing ladybugs in the lab. We were trying to map the genome of the ladybug. And so we would base a lot of where they fall on the Tree of Life on comparing like 9 different genes to see if there was any variation between these particular ones. Like, okay, well, these, have 6 genes similar to this one here, while it's only 3 genes similar to this one. And so, but they based it on like 9 different fundamental genes on that. I imagine it's vastly different in trying to determine which particular genes are associated with a type of population. Which ones are your go-to genes usually to try to say, okay, these are the British main population. Here's the Viking main. I'm just kind of curious on how that works.
There's like a difference between, I guess you would say, like population genetics tends to look within species, whereas phylogenetics, not always. You can do phylogenetics within species, but so basically, like you can use not too many genes if they're different species, because different species are very different. Does that make sense? Like they have a lot of evolutionary time to be distinct. And so you can look at a few characteristics or a few genes. Now, if you're looking within one single species, the differentiation is going to be low. So that's why what you do is you look at a lot of genes, and then the correlated patterns among those genes will tell you what
alleles and traits?
Alleles.
Traits? Okay.
Yeah, so like basically you're looking at allele frequency patterns across populations.
Mm-hmm.
And so there aren't that many alleles that are unique to a single population. Like there's some that I can tell you about, but that you can use as diagnostics. So, it could be like a positive control, be like, okay, like I know this is 100% European populations. I'll give you an example. Recently there's been some work that was done in Afrikaners who are, Dutch, Dutch Huguenot descended, like non-English speaking white South Africans with deep roots in the country. There's been a lot of genealogical and circumstantial evidence that they're about like 2 to 5% non-European, Khoisan Bushman, Black African, Asian, because there's a lot of Asian slaves that were brought into the Cape Province. And genetically that wasn't explored until there's a recent paper that came out. But, I looked at it in 2014 because I got some genotypes of Afrikaners. And it looked like they were shifted towards non-white populations. Okay, so I could tell.
Okay.
Now, I was like, okay, I'm looking at all these genes. I'm looking at 300,000 genes. But I know that there are some genes that are 100% in Europeans. And basically, what I saw is that those genes that are 100, and I'm talking like, like there's one gene that I'm thinking about, SLC24A5, where the European, common variant is very, very, the non-common variant is very, very rare, like 0.1% or less, right? And I looked at South African whites, and I was like, oh, the non-European variant is like a couple of percent. That's just, that's too suspicious, So I just realized from that, like, okay, like my analysis has to be correct because it's just way too random that the non-European variant is at a couple of percent, because in like regular European samples where we have like tens of thousands of samples, it's at like 0.1%. So we have a really, really strong confidence that it's 0.1%, not 1%. Do you see what I'm saying?
Right.
And so those are things you can do to look at like single genes, but normally you look at hundreds of thousands of genetic markers. And what we're really doing is looking at pedigrees and summarizing the information as population clusters, right? So if you're a family, you guys obviously share a lot of genes in common, genetic variants in common because you're a family. If you're an Icelander, you're on average about a third cousin with another random Icelander, because people in Iceland have lived on an island and they haven't had much immigration. If you're a British person, it's much more distant than that. But basically, if you look at a British person physically, like a native, not recent non-European ancestry, you can usually you can tell that person's not, say, South Asian or East Asian or African, right? Well, if you look at their genes, it's the exact same. The signature of the demographic history is right there. And it's not localized to a specific gene. It's just all across the genome. So like, you can have like, okay, well, a bunch of these genes are at like 20% in British people and 90% in Chinese people. The alleles are found in both populations. The frequencies are different, right? Well, if you keep looking at those patterns and you put it up, you can start to assess, okay, this individual is obviously in the British population, or you can do something as simple as just looking at the counts of similarity. So if I have a database of British people, I can look at like, okay, like how similar is their genome to, a random British person. If they're African or Chinese, like the similarity is just going to be different because, there's within a certain range, and I know that it's got to be closer than that, right? So some of it is like really abstract and abstruse, but a lot of it is really straightforward. Like ultimately, I'm kind of doing a complicated version of counting. It's just you don't normally count across 300,000.
It's like matching game.
Yeah,
very
you don't normally count across like hundreds of thousands of different characteristics. And so obviously I need a computer and I need ways to summarize the counting that seem kind of fancy. But really, I'm just like counting similarities and differences.
Yeah, I mean, fair enough. That's a pretty straightforward, and I don't want to use the term easy because it's a lot of counting, but hopefully lots of different algorithms have been developed to help you be able to isolate and find that. So
exactly.
So here's a question for you. So I know there was years ago the whole mitochondrial Eve thing, which was which was, I know National Geographic had a type of thing where you could swab your cheek and they could trace the migratory patterns of women all the way back to Africa. I haven't heard anything new about that, but how has that kind of filled in the gaps for a lot of history, do you think?
Well, I mean, So that work has been pretty much confirmed with more and more precision and power. It looks like Africa is the reserve or reservoir of modern human genetic variation, and that our species today is overwhelmingly, like say, like about 98, depending on which population, like 96 to well, I mean, outside of Africa, 96 to like 99% descended from people that lived in and around Africa 60,000 years ago. Okay. Within Africa, it's a little bit more complicated because one of the new things that we've discovered as geneticists is it looks like modern humans were hanging around Africa for a long time before a branch of them left. And so modern humans, like physically people that look vaguely like us with, higher foreheads, flatter faces. Like if you look at a Neanderthal skull, you're like, that's a different species, or not a different species, but a really, really different group of humans. People that look like us were in Africa 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. And they were just, within Africa, maybe in the Near East as well. But some of them seem to have gone out of Africa now. But they didn't leave much of an impact. So most of our ancestry is from this massive wave 60,000 years ago. And that's what the mitochondrial DNA was picking up. Everybody was a branch of Africans in that. Right. And so if you have like modern humans, like the phylogenetic tree, where everyone was in Africa from, like, let's talk about like 250,000 to 50,000. That's 200,000 years in Africa. And then the other 50,000 years is outside of Africa for everybody outside of Africa. This explains why the genetic distance between a person in China and a person in France is not really as great as you might think, because they've only had 50,000 years to diverge, assuming no mixture between the two in any way, which is actually kind of false. Within Africa, you have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. So you have some groups like the Khoisan Bushmen of South Africa that are very, very distinct. And it's because they've probably been like in Africa diverging from other modern humans for hundreds of thousands of years, And so that's why they're so genetically varied. Whereas everybody else is a subsample of a group that branched off out of Northeast Africa or the Near East, 50, 60,000 years ago. So mitochondrial Eve is true, and we just know more now.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. I had read somewhere that it's helped because the fact that a lot of history hasn't been reported so much about migratory patterns, and that was particularly useful for the worldwide input of being able to track DNA and kind of seeing where these different patterns of people had migrated from Africa across time, which I thought that was particularly interesting. So I imagine a lot of the work that you do kind of fills in holes. Because
your mitochondrial DNA is your direct maternal line, so it's only like one single lineage of all your different lineages. So I'm not passing on my mitochondria because I'm a male, because it goes from mother to daughter, to daughter to daughter to daughter. And so we're looking at one line, and that is quite informative in in important ways because of this rapid expansion out of Africa. But if you have more complex history, it gets a little confused because it can give a different signal. To give you a concrete example, if you look at the mitochondrial DNA of people in Argentina, it's like 50 to 75% look like they're indigenous, people native to the New World before the arrival of Europeans. But if you look at Argentines, they don't really look too indigenous, like definitely not like, say, Mexicans or Peruvians. And so when you look at their whole genomes, when you look across their whole genome, they look to be about like, depending on, some people are descended from like German immigrants that arrived like 100 years ago. Let's put that aside. The average Argentine is like, 70 to 85% European in ancestry, which is why they look mostly European. So what's going on there? Well, what's happening is you can have a situation where the original settlers arrive, the colonists, conquistadors, whatever you want to call them, they marry some indigenous women and they have mixed offspring. And what happens is from Spain, it was mostly men that left. And so you kept having European men come, right? And so every generation you have these Spanish men marrying these native women. And the native women are now progressively more European in ancestry. And so what happened in Argentina is that you had a lot of men migrate there. And so most of the ancestry is European, but men don't contribute mitochondrial DNA. So the mitochondrial DNA goes back to these original indigenous women that lived in, the Plata River Basin or whatever. I think the Plata, anyway, the river around Buenos Aires, right? And so these are the details that are being filled in. Or if you look at African Americans, their mitochondrial DNA tends to be like 90 to 95% African, I think. But if you look at their Y chromosome, their paternal lineage, it's about like 30%, 35% European. And that's because African Americans are about 20% European, and a lot of that ancestry is from European men, not European women. And so these are some of the holes the whole genome analyses and just like more in-depth can fill in, just kind of like reconstructing people's individual histories or population histories.
Okay. All of this is fascinating. Okay, so let me take the conversation a little bit of different direction. Let me get a couple. I think we might have a couple questions in the chat. Hemp Hill says Celtic genetics have also been gaining interest with related groups in West China and Iberia. Do you have any info on that?
Yeah. I mean, I've looked at those genotypes. It's like, so a lot of these, it's like, I've analyzed the data myself, so I can like, give you my own spin. So the reason that it was connected to the Celts is because of the Tartans. So the people in Xinjiang that used to live in Western Turkestan, seem to have migrated from the Volga steppe like 4,000 years ago around there. There's multiple waves actually, and they spoke multiple different languages. So some of them spoke Iranian languages. Some of them spoke a language called Tocharian, which is Indo-European, but it's extinct and not related to any other Indo-Europeans. And so they seem to have been part of the broad expansion of Indo-Europeans that occurred 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. The Celtic people are part of that. They obviously went west, and other people went east, to China. And so, they're connected together. The modern people, the Uyghur people who are in the news right now because they're subject of like ethnic and religious persecution in China, they look to have some of their ancestry from these groups, which makes sense if you look at their Y chromosomes, and you look at some of their physical features are more European-like. And then some of their, about 40% of their ancestry is Western. Like, I'm just say Western broadly, because some of it's like Persians and some of it's more like Eastern Europeans. It's a mix of various types, right? And so these old connections go back probably 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. Yeah, closer to 4,000. And so they do connect people in Western Europe to people in this area, because people in Western Europe, right now in Northwestern Europe, most of the ancestry descends from people that arrived from the steppe, like over 50%. And say in Britain, there was a huge discontinuity in the Neolithic, about like 2,500 BC, where the people that were mostly farmers were mostly replaced by people that came from the continent and from what is today Eastern Europe, the western edge of the Eurasian steppe. And so you can go east, you can go west, you can go south, you can go all these directions. And so you go trace it all back, and it goes back to that area, at least within like 4,000 to 5,000 years. Wow. It's a little different in southern. There's more with the local European farmers. So, and that there is an Iberian connection there.
There you go. Let me see if there's any other questions. Tatted Philosophy, you are smart enough to ask a question. Of course you can. So think of one. Doesn't matter what the question is. All righty. Let me see. I thought I saw another one in here. Somebody had said they thought that they had, where was it? I thought they decided mitochondrial DNA wasn't maternal only.
Yeah, there's still controversy about that. So men carry mitochondrial DNA. The controversy is whether it gets transmitted from men. Okay? And I think the easiest way to say it is there's been multiple reports of this since the late 1990s. And it always turns out to be like, there's like cases where that happens and then the people are sterile, so it doesn't matter. Does that make sense? So I mean, I can look it up again, but when they say that it's not maternal only, it always turns out to be a very, very rare exception that doesn't affect our phylogenetic inferences. Like, it doesn't seem to have any impact. So yeah, I think there are some real reports there, but whenever people have dug deeper, it doesn't impact the stuff that I'm talking about. Like, it's interesting molecular biology, but it's not really population genetics or phylogenetically relevant. That's the way I would say.
Right. So there's no contribution to the gene pool if they manage to get their mitochondrial DNA from their dad.
The last time this happened, they did a follow-up and it turned out all those individuals for some reason were sterile, so it didn't matter.
Ha, I see. Well,
there's something like that, right?
happens.
So I don't follow it too closely because this is kind of like epigenetics. People say epigenetics is transforming everything, but if epigenetics was such an important force, if paternal transmission of mitochondria was such an important force, we wouldn't have been able to do the things that we've done, right? So if paternal transmission was, there are like 20 million, there are like, well, I mean, 23andMe does that. There are about 10 million people in the United States right now that have done genetic testing where they have their mitochondria, and a lot of those people, if paternal transmission was common, you'd have a lot of people reporting that they have the one from their dad, not their mom. That's not happening.
Right.
So that tells you it's very, very rare if it happens.
Right.
Okay.
Michael Roble says, how about forensic evidence? How does that go? I guess people in the chat are kind of curious. How does the genetic testing for DNA for a crime scene or forensic evidence? What happens in that process?
Well, yeah, as you guys know, that's a big deal. It's a big space. A lot of stuff is happening. Private sector, government, to some extent in academia. With the ancient DNA, if it's like 10,000 years ago, obviously it's going to be heavily degraded. It's like half-life. With the contamination increases. With forensics, a lot of that stuff is really more recent, and so there is good preservation, and it's a very, very exciting field. So there's two angles to forensics. One is just like identification. So, I can tell you, I could tell you if someone's. I can do the same pop gen analysis on a forensic sample as I could do on just a regular thing. So, there was a sample, that I heard about that was from a migrant who died in Arizona. I mean, they thought it was a migrant. They weren't sure. The remains were kind of, they genotyped the individual, and it matched Maya Indians.
Wow.
So it's probably someone from Guatemala or southern Mexico,
Yeah.
And so you can find out things like that. And the other thing is you can actually infer certain things about their physical appearance. You can predict with pretty high confidence that someone has blue eyes. That's pretty easy. Skin color is a little harder, but we're getting better and better. Obviously, biological sex is pretty easy for most people. And then, you can do physical appearance and stuff like that. Then those are getting better and better.
If they had any genetic disorder.
Forensics are not super interested in their diseases because, if it's like a crime scene, that's a way to identify them. But really, you're looking mostly for appearance and ancestry,
Right.
And so it's an incredible tool in forensics. There are some limitations because, DNA is not magic. It can tell you that someone touched something somewhere, but you still got to do the due diligence of were they there at that time? If it's like a crime scene, you're gonna have a lot of DNA there, and that's why rape is often a special case because there's genetic material that's pretty hard to, have in that circumstance. Right. But if you're looking at, say, if you're looking at a surface, which I don't think usually there's DNA on surfaces, but if you're looking at a waste bin, that's a common thing. People will blow their nose and stuff like that. You can get DNA from that. But how many people are going to be using that waste bin, right? And what time? So, you could limit it to say, oh, there were 50 people. There's 50 genetic individuals that used this waste bin between the last time it was discarded and when the crime happened. That's useful. But you don't know which of those 50 necessarily. You still have to do the due diligence. So genetics is a tool, but it's not magic. That's all. That's generally what I would say.
Okay. I have a couple more questions. How do non-Homo sapien groups such as Neanderthals show up in modern humans outside of Africa? Higher concentrations of DNA in certain European areas? That's from Hemp Hill. So.
Yeah. So the first thing is there's still a debate about whether you want to call them homos or not. But I think most geneticists are of the broad view that you just call everybody human and Homo sapiens for the last couple of million years, including Neanderthals and everything else. because, we're geneticists. It's because, like, we know that we could interbreed. We know that we can interact, see their genes and our genes. Paleoanthropologists and anatomists, they have different views. I mean, I'm not very good at the bone stuff, but if you look at a Neanderthal skull, like, they look really different. Like, they would have, you know what I'm saying? Like, it would have looked really different. So I understand why they say that they're not Homo sapiens, but I am of the persuasion and the view that they were Homo sapiens too. They were just Homo sapiens Neanderthalis, like maybe a different subspecies. You can use that word. Like, these are all like vague words from a genetic perspective. But so that is something. And then in terms of in Europeans, basically it looks like the mixture happened like 40, 50,000 years ago, like closer to like 50,000 years ago, probably a little earlier. Probably in the Middle East, because they're Neanderthals in the northern Middle East, like in modern day Turkey, northern Iraq, Syria, and it's all across Eurasia and the Old World. Within European populations, there's a little bit of variation, but that variation is due to possibly mixture with later populations that didn't have as much Neanderthal ancestry. There's really not that much variation. Northern and Eastern Europeans, I think, have just a bit more than Southern and Western European. So if there was like, and Middle Easterners have somewhat less than Europeans, East Asians, lesser extent South Asians have a little bit more than Europeans. So there's very, very subtle differences, but we're talking like 1.8 to 2.2%, that range, but there are differences. Someone's asking about a gene for big beards.
Yes.
Not that I know of. A lot of the hair stuff is super fascinating to me. Like, why do people bald? Why do some people have curly hair and all this stuff? And it's obviously genetic, but there's not much research on it. And one reason is, like, how are you going to fund it? The NSF, National Science Foundation, I think it has a high bar for human funding because it just assumes that the NIH, National Institutes of Health, will be funding it, And so if it's frivolous, the NSF isn't going to fund it. And the NIH, like, balding is not really a disease. Like, having a lot of hair is not really a disease. And so, the reason that we don't know is because of just the way science is set up with how the funding happens for a trait. So we know that it's heritable and that some people have like I can't grow a full beard. I just can't. And I don't know why that is. Genetically, I have my genome, all that stuff, but I don't know. Nobody knows. But it runs in families. At some point, we'll figure it out just because it'll be cheap enough to analyze all these things. But, give it like 2, 3, 4 years. There's a lot of fun characteristics that are just aesthetically salient to us, like that we notice, that nobody really knows the genetics of too much. A lot of it is stuff you hear about high school, like detached versus non-detached earlobes. We don't know the genetics of that yet, but we know it's genetic, if that makes sense. Yes. But it's not a disease to have attached earlobes. I have detached earlobes, so that's what I'm saying. Like, it's not a disease to have attached earlobes, So.
Right. If attached earlobes were linked to hearing loss, then they'd be like, okay, we need to figure out.
And you get funding for that. You could get funding for that. Right. And so, like albinism, like, just like having no pigmentation and like just a lot of pigmentation genetics is funded because albinos tend to have hearing loss, and blind people are more likely to be deaf. Very, very fair people are more likely to be deaf. And so there has been actually some study of pigmentation because of the study of the genetics of deafness.
I see. That's particularly interesting. I learned some new things today. So I have a question here. The Golden State Killer was surprised they caught him. So we can kind of go into the whole genetic testing, the home genetic testing. And, I've talked a bit about complications that can come from that, privacy concerns, what you can do to get around that. What are your thoughts about that and the potentials, for, solving crimes and the ethics? What are your 2 cents, as it were?
So I'm actually working on a project, a white paper on genetic privacy, so it's on my mind. Ultimately, genetics is going to be a ubiquitous tool. Everyone's going to have it. There's right now you can identify white Americans pretty easily from publicly available genetic databases, but in like 5 years, it's going to be all Americans of all races, because what you're doing is you're sampling a pedigree, and you just need a couple of individuals within part of the tree to figure out relatedness. And so the Golden State Killer was, a lot of people thought, like, why did it even take that long? I mean, this was like pretty straightforward. in terms of like the implications of it, most people I think are okay with this idea of like, okay, there's a serial killer out there. We need to find who it is. On the other hand, there has been issues where it's like, someone like left, there was an assault and someone wanted to, I think, genetically test something, and people were like, well, I mean, and it was an assault, like they mugged someone or they shoplifted. I don't know. But it wasn't like an incredibly violent crime, and people were just like, should we be using genetics to like identify people like this through their relatives? So I think like we need to think about how common this is going to be and what we're going to use it for in a legal context. In a non-legal context, ultimately, once the technology gets like fast enough, I think it's actually going to be pretty common to just people like do things surreptitiously. Just like genotype people. Like if within 10 years, we might have devices that can genotype just samples that you get.
Yeah.
And that's going to be, I mean, it's going to be like Black Mirror land. A lot of like issues related to privacy or the lack thereof. Right now, a lot of people don't have the genetic privacy they think they do because they don't understand that like they have a cousin. Give a concrete example. I mean, there's examples I can give you. I'll give you a concrete example. There's a case that I know where a friend got a genetic match, and this friend is like white American, just typical white American, and they got a genetic match with someone who was half African American. And that was weird because it wasn't like weird, but it was like a close relative, and they didn't know they had any Black relatives. And basically, to make a long story short, they had a cousin who had a relationship with an African American, and they'd given the child up for adoption. And they didn't tell anyone.
Wow.
And they did it twice, actually. Because another person matched 6 months later. And these two individuals adopted out, they didn't know that they had a full sibling out there.
Wow.
Okay. And that was weird. And the cousin was, shocked because, she thought this was her secret,
Yeah.
And it's not. And there's multiple people these people are matching up with now. So the cat's out of the bag. And there are some older people that aren't on, genetic sites yet, so they don't know, but they will know. This is not uncommon. This is very common because if you look back in your pedigree, something weird is going to come up if you look through enough steps, right? And so if you go back 200 years, you're going to find something that's a surprise for a lot of people. Maybe not most, but a lot.
Fair enough. People are talking about Gattaca in the chat, and I actually enjoy that film as well. I do worry, possibly, is this going to be a new way for discrimination? Because we already have people that misrepresent science often for their own particular oppressive ideologies. So I wonder how that is going to be addressed. And I don't have an answer.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. One issue that I have with geneticists that are talking about how that's bad, that's eugenics, is like they don't. Right now, there are non-invasive prenatal testing for Down syndrome in the United States. And the estimates are like anywhere from 70 to 90% of the positive tests are aborted. Okay.
Right.
That's having an effect on there are no, like, for example, Denmark has almost no young children with Down syndrome now. Right.
Right.
People don't talk about that as eugenics. And I think one of the reasons they don't talk about it as eugenics is because so many people do it. It's not talked about, but it's common. Okay.
Right.
I mean, if you're 35 and above in the United States, insurance actually will cover these prenatal tests now. So, we have to be careful about what we're talking about. I think maybe eugenics is already happening. We just don't call it that, So for like test tube babies, we don't call test tube babies anymore. It's very common. And I don't think you want to call someone around a test tube baby, right? But if you read the coverage in the 1980s, it was very, very, like, people were terrified. And now, I mean, these people are in college, they're just random people walking around. So, there are things you could do that, are ethically horrible. And, I think, frankly, you have to look at China to see some of the things they're possibly thinking about. In the United States, it's mostly driven by personal choice. So I don't know what you could do about that if we have freedom. On the other hand, there are issues like with health insurance, it's not that big of a deal, but with long-term care insurance, that market is going bankrupt apparently, because people know what their risks are and all this stuff. So there's a lot that's going on in that space. I like that, Gattaca is actually utopia, but I'm just joking. I'm a geneticist, these are never going to be that good at individual level, but there are going to be people that are going to be did, and we need to think about what that means. Right now, we have the American with Disabilities Act, and so if you have certain types of disabilities, you get certain considerations or school. You get more time, and that's actually being abused, as we know, for like standardized testing. Very, very affluent, like rich communities have like really high rates of disability, so they get more time. But in any case, we make certain accommodations. I think like if you have a genetic condition, and we know from birth, which we will know for a lot of people, it's really not your fault, So I think we're going to make certain accommodations for that in terms of like national health care. I mean, I think that's probably coming. We're probably going to just like socialize that. And I'm not a big fan of socialism, just so you know, but healthcare, I think we're going to socialize it. And I think it kind of makes sense because, if you're like 5 and you have a genetic condition, it's not your fault. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
People are going to take care of you, right? Someone's going to pay for it somewhere. And so I think when it comes to like diseases, like we need to like, protect people from undue discrimination. On the other hand, we've been doing genetic discrimination for all of history. Just because we have genes doesn't mean that we didn't know about genetics. Like good-looking people want to date good-looking people, or some people want to date tall people, some people want to date intelligent people, some people want to date people just of their own race. There's all sorts of things that we've used genetics for. We just didn't call it that because we're using the physical characteristics of people or their pedigree.
The phenotype.
Yeah. Now that we have the genotype, and there are going to be dating services where it's like people are going to look at their MHC, their immune profiles, and other things, and genetic compatibilities. A lot of it's going to be fake marketing, but some of it's going to be legit. And there are already instances where, like if you go in to have children, if you go in and you want to have children, like you can go to the doctors and get a carrier screening test to see if you have any risks, of the two of you, and that's pretty much free. Insurance will come, and so that's information we know now, like I've been through it myself, and so it's just we don't talk about it anymore. But like 20 years ago, we would have been amazed. Like what used to be a hypothesis or speculation is now just reality, and so we don't talk about it as amazing. It's just the way it is. Like I know my whole genotype basically, and I know my mtDNA and my Y chromosome. 20 years ago, that would have been amazing because the only place that there were genetic data sets was in places, what is it, like Stanford or Harvard or Berkeley. And there were probably like, actually I know there were like a couple of thousand in the world.
Wow.
Now there's 20 million people, and you could just go buy it yourself. So that's changed.
I have a couple more questions in the chat. Let's see. Any correlation like autism to favorable traits? That comes from Thork.
So there is some evidence the genetics of intelligence and stuff is advancing. It's still pretty primitive compared to other things. There's a lot of genes involved. There is some circumstantial evidence that it's not autism necessarily, but there is evidence that some people with higher intelligences may have a slight, like a genetic propensity. So we're not talking about just they have higher intelligence, but there are genes associated with people with higher intelligence. And you look at those people like have a higher likelihood of, say, like I think bipolar or schizophrenia, like various types of neuroticism and ADHD. There's other things that are going on where, people with very, very high intelligences might actually be, like, as the stereotype would suggest, a little bit fragile in a way. And so, autism is complicated because it's highly heritable. It runs in families. And so we know it's got a genetic basis. It's like schizophrenia. It's one of the most heritable things out. So depending on who you ask, schizophrenia is like 60 to 80% heritable, which means 60 to 80% of the variation of the population is due to variation in the genes. For comparison, intelligence is closer to like 50%. Height is around the same range as schizophrenia, maybe a little higher. And so schizophrenia and autism are highly heritable. They do run in families. And it could be that, creativity, for example, there is some suggestive evidence, and a lot of this hasn't been published yet. I'm just talking to the researchers. Creativity might be correlated with high intelligence plus certain things we classify as mental illness, because it's a distribution, right? Like, it's not like you're schizophrenic and you're not schizophrenic. If you don't sleep, you develop hallucinations.
Right.
Everybody does. Okay, happens to everybody. And in fact, like, if you're like in a dark cemetery, you're paranoid.
Yeah.
Like, you think that's human psychology kicking in. So it's not like schizophrenics are just mentally totally different. They're just at a different end of the spectrum. And I've had arguments with psychologists about this. I mean, I do believe this, and I think that's a defensible position, that schizophrenia, just like autism, is a spectrum disorder. And at a certain point, you can't function. But at other points, you're just eccentric.
Mm.
You know?
Okay.
So,
well, I mean, I can believe that, because we see a huge diversity in various populations for expression of different things, whether it's anxiety, depression, you know, autism, in any of those things. They all tend to be a spectrum anyway. So it would make sense if schizophrenia.
Neurodiversity is real.
Yes. Oh, I agree with you. Here's another question from Hemp Hill. Are there currently models that predict genetic drifts that may occur in the next 1,000 to 3,000 years, especially considering climate change?
All right, so I don't think he's talking about drift. I think he's talking more about selection. So drift is just random walk processes. The issue with genetic drift is, like, it's really fast if or it makes a big difference if you have a small population, and we don't have a small population. So the genetic drift that impacts us happen. So everybody outside of Africa is descended from like 1,000 people that, like, a single tribe, like 50,000 years ago. That's why we're genetically so similar compared to Africans. Okay, like, we're all descended from like 100 to 1,000 people, like me, you, and probably him, although I don't know. You know, so that's a huge effect on our genome. But now we're billions of people, and many of us are reproducing. So we obviously aren't genetically drifting that much. I mean, we are, but it's technically true. He's talking about selection, and we look different. Like, you know, Mel and I look different, and our ancestors were the exact same people 50,000 years ago. In fact, a lot of our ancestors were the exact same 5,000 years ago, you know, but we look different. Like, what happened? Well, a lot of it is selection. So, I mean, depending on the time scale, yeah, like, we will be selected in different ways, and there's already selection for, I think, different things. You know, there are a lot of, like, we used to die much earlier. And so now mostly people die of heart disease and cancer and other things. And that's going to have some effect on selection. But a lot of it is also just like choices and cultural choices. So, you know, in the future, everybody in North America might be Amish, and everybody in Europe might be Roma, going by like fertility rates. Right. And so, I mean, it could, just like looking at like how fast the Amish are growing, I don't think that that's a reasonable projection. But if you're looking at 1,000 years from now, everybody in the United States will be Amish, because the Amish are way above replacement and everybody else is a little bit below replacement. So you just extrapolate out the math. I think selection might be selecting for certain types of personalities, certain types of dispositions, because, you know, like, I have 3 kids, and I'm going to tell you, like, that's expensive, but, you know, Americans have a lot of money, and they like to do a lot of things with their money, and that's why I'm saying it's expensive. You know, if I wanted to have 20 kids, I could probably afford it. I would just have to live a very different lifestyle. The Amish are okay with that. Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn are okay with that. They live in what I would consider poverty, especially the Orthodox Jews. The Amish tend to do better because they live in rural areas. Cost of living is different, but they want to have a lot of children, right? And that's their choice. So that's evolution at work. Evolution is basically only going to favor the people that have children, you know, or their relatives are going to have children. So that's just how it is. And so, yeah, climate change could have some effect. But I mean, I think the biggest effect of climate change is that, like, you know, northern countries are probably going to benefit a lot. Northern and southern, but mostly northern, because south, you know, aside from like southern Chile and Argentina, you know, Australia is not that far south compared to, you know, northern. I think climate change has cultural impact. There could be like some, but I mean, and like in hot climates, most people stay indoors anyway now, you know.
Right. It's all kind of up in the air with some of that, though. Hopefully we're able to do something about climate change and adapt as well. I think
yeah,
one
I mean,
of the biggest things
at this point, that's our
sorry.
only hope. I mean, I'm not a specialist in this, but everyone I talk to says that like it's not like we're gonna stop it. We can affect it on the edges and the margin, but we just have to like figure out a way to adapt so our civilization can continue. It's just inevitability with the technologies, and I mean, ultimately, like I have a friend, I don't know if you know him, Ramez Nam. He does a lot of like renewable commentary and stuff, and that stuff is literally is coming online, but it's going to take time, and you still have China and India that are developing, and coal and these other things are cheap, you know. Although China's really improving fast, so you know, from a biological
go ahead.
Yeah. From a biological perspective, I think the primary thing though is the choices people make on who to have children and who is having children. And so the United States has sub replacement fertility, but one thing you have to remember is each generation, the people that culturally choose to have children are going to be a larger and larger percentage of the population. So eventually, everyone's going to be descended from people that, whether for cultural reasons or personality reasons, likes to have children. You know, and so I don't think that in the long term our population is actually going to decline. It's going to decline, and then everyone who has not too many children is not going to leave any descendants, and the people that are going to remain are the people that decide to have a lot of children. You know, so that's the evolution of the future, in my opinion. That's really evident to me.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to really throw some money into more food, GMOs. You know, because we're going to have heat resistant plants and drought resistant plants and all of that. And so all these people that are GMOs are bad. No, they're not. They're going to save your life.
Yeah, I think lab grown meat or like meat substitutes are going to probably take over and replace most meat. I think some people will still like a good steak because, like, you know, the texture and the ligaments and all that stuff, you can't really grow that in the lab. Burgers you can replace, but other stuff it's harder. I think there will still be meat eating in the future, but I think it's going to be more like a special thing, whereas just like the regular meats, because, you know, most people, like, they eat hot dogs, they eat lunch meat, they eat hamburgers, like this sort of stuff doesn't need to be from real animals. You know, it's like, no. And so I'm imagining that will be a huge change. Just, you know, by the end of the 21st century, people will be pretty amazed that everyone used to eat meat from, like, you know, living animals instead of just like a special thing, you know?
No, not at all. So we're coming up on an hour. Why don't you tell everybody, I know you told us at the beginning, where can they find you? Where can they drop questions if they happen to have any more questions? Your website, talk about your podcast, just kind of revisit that.
So I can find everything is razib.com, razib.com. And so I have all the links there. So links to my Twitter, which is Razib Khan, RazibKhan. And I do generally respond on Twitter, but I've been doing less of that. So if you want to send me an email, you can go through the razib.com. And so you can keep in touch there. There's a link to my podcast there, which is on iTunes, Stitcher, everything. It's called The Insight. It's also on Spotify. And I have a blog called Gene Expression, gnxp.com. I have some other stuff, other blogs, like other stuff that I've written. My company's website is incyto.me, and I have a blog that's on Medium that is linked from there as well. And yeah, I think that's like most of the way I distribute stuff. Like, I have like a public Facebook page if anyone wants to, like, I don't know what that's about, but I got one because people kept asking me for one. So if you want to like my public Facebook page, go ahead. And I am, like, reachable via that Facebook. If you want to message me, I'm probably more like, because my direct messages are not open. So if you want to at me, I might. Yeah. So, you know, just so you guys know, a lot of you probably on Twitter, I've really started noticing over the last couple of weeks that they've really been clamping down on smaller accounts. I've had friends who Twitter has automatically had me unfollow them without telling me. So they tried to direct message me and they couldn't. There are other people. Yeah, there are other people where I can't it doesn't automatically complete their name, which is strange when I try to direct message them because I'm following them, but they're a small account. So Twitter is not really optimal anymore to, like, contact me because Twitter thinks you're a troll. Basically, what they're doing is they're getting rid of all the trolls and bots by looking at accounts with not too many followers. But some of those people are my friends. So It's impacting me. But I want to put that out there. If I don't respond, that's part of what's going on. And I've really been noticing this over like the last month. They've really, really been cranking up. Like I have a blue check. I have a lot of followers. So I don't think I'm impacted. But what's impacting me is the people I interact with, because, you know, it's not like I don't interact with that many journalists. So I don't interact with that many blue checks. I interact with a lot of people that have like, that follow like 200 people and have 100 followers. And that's what Twitter's clamping down on. And they're not necessarily telling you. They're not telling you that they're hiding your account. Do you know who DJ Growth is? Growth? I don't know what it is. Anyway, he used to be like James Randi Foundation, and we were direct messaging yesterday, and I was like, oh, yeah, like I see that you're on Facebook, but I never, you know, you don't tweet anymore. And he's like, no, I'm still tweeting. And so I was like, okay, that's strange. So I went to his timeline, and there's all these tweets, and I'm like, why am I not seeing these tweets? 2 years ago, I'd always see his tweets.
Yeah.
So Twitter's just doing what's mapping tweets, you know. And so I just want to, not to be a conspiracy theorist, because I'm not. I think this is conscious.
They do shadow ban. It's weird. We call that shadow ban. Yeah. You can go and
these are not people who are shadow banned.
That's so weird.
They're algorithmic, and I think I'm partly seeing this because I have a blue check, and so they think, oh, I don't want to interact with these people, or like, you know, whatever. Yeah. But I mean, ultimately, like the people that I really want to interact with are like scientists and other people that are, you know, interested in these topics, and they don't have a blue check. They don't have a lot of followers, so I'm kind of getting really frustrated. That's one reason I'm not tweeting as much, because I'm like, why should I contribute to this platform that's going to be for like celebrities and journalists that work at the New York Times? That's just whatever. That's not what I'm there for. So sorry, just a rant, but it's been really frustrating the last couple of weeks.
Feel free. It's quite frustrating. I don't see all of my mentions either, and I think I have over 7,000 followers, but I don't see all of my mentions. People would be like, and I'll go through. I may not respond to all of them, but I at least go through and let people know I read them, because I'll like all of them. Yeah. Okay, I read this, and so that's, you know, but. Still, I don't see them all. I'll look on like my desktop and I'll be like, oh, there's tweets I didn't even know were there. So exactly. I get it.
If you use a different platform, you see different things. And I have had IRL friends who follow me on Twitter who've tweeted at me, and they're like, how come you didn't like respond to that direct question, Razib? And I'm like, what are you even talking about? And then like, I can't see it. And then I have to like go in and like, this might be abusive. And I'm just like, what?
Oh my God.
Yeah, you know, that's happened to me, and it's happened more and more and more, and so I'm just like, enough, you know.
I hate when it says this big thing up at the bottom. It says view more messages, and you click, and there's like a one-liner.
Yep.
That's it.
Oh God.
Like,
yeah.
You just show
there's that. Yeah, there's that, and there's like could be abusive. Mm-hmm. Could be abusive. The big thing. I'm sorry, I'm ranting about this. The big thing is like if you follow a lot of people. Don't have a lot of followers, that's when it's penalizing you. Those are the people I'm noticing who are penalized. But the problem with that is, yes, I understand a lot of trolls do that, but a lot of people who are interested in a lot of things do that.
Yes, that's like how they get their news. A lot of people who are interested in a lot of things, and you know they don't have that many followers because they have a job and they're not tweeting much. So why are you penalizing these people? Like I would be enraged or not enraged, but I would just be like, what's the point then? You know, if they were assuming that I was a troll. Just because I followed a lot of people, you know? And so I've had to tell people like, I see that message, and, you know, they had me, and like the people who I've been auto unfollowed from are those people. Yeah. But if I follow someone with not that many followers, I want to follow them. I don't follow everybody reciprocally, you know? So I'm going to give you a concrete example. If you're a geneticist studying a topic that I'm interested in, I don't care if you have 20 followers, I'm going to follow you, you know? And I've done that. If you look at who I follow. And then what happens is, oh, this geneticist is following 100 people. Their ratio is 5 to 1. That's bad. Razib, you have a blue check. Twitter's like, okay, we're going to have you unfollow them, and we're not going to tell you. It drives me insane. That's wrong. I don't know if I've unfollowed anyone.
I respond to comments on my blog pretty regularly. I try to like, you know, maintain that. I respond to my Facebook pretty regularly. I respond to email. Like if you click, like you'll see, if you go to razib.com, you'll see that where the email is. And, you know, I still monitor Twitter, but, you know, that's more just like, I'm using Twitter now as a consumer, like keep track of the news and stuff. I'm not putting back into the ecosystem that's so disrespectful to the people that are putting in stuff for free. And I'm not talking about me. I'm talking about like Twitter is the people, or it was. And now I think Twitter is becoming a platform for celebrities and institutions that have inside hookups where they can get their people blue checked. And that's fine. It's a free country. I just don't have to participate, and I'm not going to.
Yeah, I don't blame you. And I know you've sent me all of your links, and so I'll update the description with links for them to contact you, because I only have 2 websites, but I'll go and add more after we're done. So you can ask Razib your genetics questions, all that you want, evolution, genetics, any of that, through his website, and check out his podcast. And thank you for being here. This has been fun.
Yeah. Yes. And one last thing, like I do take ideas for the podcast from people, the people, because there's a lot of things in genetics that I'm passionate about, but I don't know what people are interested in. So if you guys have ideas about the podcast, definitely email me, because I have like routinely contacted people or talked about things because of, listener suggestions.
Awesome. I do that too on my Saturday shows. All of my Saturday shows, Saturday Morning Science, those are all viewer generated topics. The Saturday string theory. How nice. So for you, awesome. All things genetics. So please do check out Razib. Thank you so much for being on this show. This has been utterly fascinating. I know I've enjoyed it. Have you enjoyed it, Dave?
Yes, I have.
I think Dave was in the chat going, I love this content. Yeah. And so thank you guys in the chat for checking it out. If I didn't get to your questions, please feel free to either put them in the comments. I'll send them to Razib, or go to his website, razib.com, and check out the goodness there. And so this is ScientistMel signing off. Thank you, Razib.